Sir.
The pilot who flew that just prior to Buckley, Sterling,
That's right. Yes.
Sorry.
No, I knew that. Okay, in addition to all these fighters that were kind of the mainstream fighters, we also had the Weird and Wonderful. We had the Supermarine Nighthawk, which was a Zeppelin stalker. A comic version of the Camel for night fighting, and I don't have time to tell you all this detail about why it's done that way. Then we had float plane fighters, we had flying boat fighters, and the Cadrone R11 in the upper left was probably the world's only successful escort fighter, which means that a multi-seat fighter that flies along with the bombers as an escort plane. That has been tried many, many times. The only really successful version of that was the Cadrone R11. It was as fast as the bombers, carried 5 flexible machine guns, and it was very effective against the German fighter planes. We have armored fighters. The Sopwith Salamander was one that was just starting to be built at the end of the war for trench strafing. Then we had carrier-borne fighters at the end. The photo on the right shows Sopwith Camels, the shipboard version of that, on the HMS Furious. These are en route to the world's first carrier airstrike. And that photo was taken before they launched the aircraft. Okay? So, in summary, the early combat aircraft used the idea of naval warfare as the precedent, but the pilot flew the aircraft, they had one or more gunners to shoot at the other airplanes, but that quickly was rendered obsolete by the third dimension of the air, and the fighters as we know them today were developed. The first fighters were armed variants of pre-war airframes, and then they learned to add synchronized machine guns on there, and then that started the technical arms race that has continued to this day of developing a better aircraft. Okay. Do we have time for a minute, 1 or 2 questions, or is that?
Yeah.
Let me take the host's privilege of asking the first question. And I wanted to ask you to maybe say a few words about our local connection, the Tanforan racetrack, the air show of 1910, and the first bomb that was ever dropped from an airplane, dropped into San Francisco Bay. But also, and that was just a little plug, a local plug. But actually, I wanted to ask you about a story I had heard that the first dogfight occurred in the Mexican Revolution in 1910, where 2 American pilots who had been hired took pot shots at each other with revolvers. I don't know if you've ever heard that story.
I have not. How would I put it? There's always been armed conflict, so I have not heard about that particular story. But so I wanted to focus on the main event here. I want to also emphasize that there's way more than I can cover in an hour, and so there's a book upstairs that you may want to look at that I wrote as I did this presentation to give you the story more in depth. It's got over 500 photographs to show you a lot more than I can show you here and cover a lot more stuff. I have not heard the story that you asked about, but I will say that there's a museum up the way that talks about local aviation. There's a lot more, the Hiller Air Museum, which is, I've been there, and there was a lot more to it than I realized.
There's another museum, Wings of History in San Martin, across the street from the South County Airport.
That's good to know.
It covers 1920, 1940 airplanes.
And then, of course, Moffett Field. That's amazing. Any questions for Jen? Yeah.
On average, the last 2 generations of fighters, what is the, if we can average, rate of climb? What do you imagine the rate of climb is?
A really good fighter at the end of the war would climb at 1,000 feet per minute starting out. And of course, that drops off with altitude because the air gets less dense and the engine's power drops off. And they did not have superchargers or turbochargers at that time to compensate for that. They were actually, both sides were testing superchargers, but they were not in operation. Had the war lasted into 1919, we probably would have seen supercharged aircraft. Yeah, and the genius of Fokker at the end of the war was the wooden cantilever airfoil, which with the thick airfoil with the leading edge, very rounded leading edge, and also the thick airfoil enabled them to eliminate all of the bracing wires externally, and the bracing wires create a huge amount of drag. And so, anyway, there's a lot more discussion than we have time to talk about here, but sure. And a fast fighter plane in those days was 130, 135 miles an hour.
Yeah, there, Dwight.
Talk about the average amount of flight time people had before they were in combat.
Well, I think the average pilot would reach this squadron with probably under 100 hours of flight time, and not too much solo. The training of the time was pretty primitive, pretty cursory, although it got much better as the war progressed.
I have a question regarding the kind of the image of the flying A's and the image of the World War I airplane. Have you noticed that? I've noticed that certain planes in certain generations are seen in paintings and the popular culture images more so than others.
Sure.
Which generation of those do you think kind of contributes to this image, or is it kind of an amalgam of all of the generations as it happens?
Well, I think that you're looking at basically third generation onward through the fifth, because that's when the air combat got very intense. The aces were highly publicized. I think most people have seen Snoopy and the Red Baron, this sort of thing, and the airplane, the most famous airplane in World War I is probably the airplane that the Red Baron was flying when he was killed, the all-red triplane. And I will also say that it's interesting that in a war where millions and millions of people were killed, if we look at it today, there's only one warrior from that entire war that is known to the general public at all, and that is the Red Baron. Most people don't know anything about him, but they'll have heard of him. And he was a fighter ace. Okay, and we can talk about that. Again, I don't have.
This just has to do with my encounter with a very elderly British gentleman by the name of Peter Brothers. Told me about his first encounter with armor. He took a stove lid plate, set off in an aircraft off the stove.
Improvisation.
I'm curious, I read a book on Shot Down the Red Baron, and the author claimed that the Red Baron was actually shot down by gunfire, not by ground fire, not by
Yes.
ground. What is your opinion?
Yes, that's almost certainly correct. Now, we will never know for 100% certain. Just like I showed you the photos of Francesco Baracca. He was killed in action, probably attacking an Austro-Hungarian two-seater. And we know the crew, they were given, in the airplane, they were given credit for shooting him down. The Italians claim it was ground fire. We don't know. We'll probably never know for sure. But I think in the case of the Red Baron, what I would say is this: he broke one of his own rules, which was to chase an enemy aircraft low over enemy country, enemy territory, where everybody with a rifle could take a shot at him, and that was fatal.
Yeah.
Did the Wright brothers or Glenn Curtis make any contribution to developing these planes?
Well, the Wright brothers not so much. Obviously, they built the first successful aircraft, but they also got involved in a lot of patent disputes, and the technology that they created was very primitive compared to this. Now, I did publish a book last year by a fellow author named Robert Cassar, 88 years old last year, and he'd been working on this book for 60 years, and it covers all the American military aircraft from 1908, from the first Wright Flyer bought by the U.S. Army, up until the end of World War I. And it's interesting to me that it took this long for that story to be told. But I think the reason for it was that the story of American military aviation during that period was not a success story in general. Not a happy story. It was kind of embarrassing in a lot of ways. And I think that's probably one reason why other people didn't want to go there. They'd much rather talk about the good news.
Yeah, Joe?